Hey friends, tonight's journey might keep you awake longer than you planned because we're not just drifting through medieval castles or candlelit chapels tonight. We're stepping into the shadows that history tried to bury, into the quiet corners of the Middle Ages, where faith and fear lived side by side and where some souls grew darker than the nights themselves. So before we begin, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe grab a blanket and let the world outside fade away. If you're new here, I'd love to have you join this calm corner of history, but only if you truly enjoy stories that blur the line between fascination and fear. Now take a deep breath and let's wander into the forgotten alleys of the medieval mind, where the deadliest souls were not monsters from myths, but people who walked among saints, soldiers, and kings. Our story begins in a Europe still wrapped in superstition and smoke. The kind of world where a flickering candle wasn't just light, it was protection. In this age, priests spoke of sin, kings preached order, and peasants prayed the plague wouldn't visit again. But among the prayers and the penance, there were others, quiet, patient, and cruel, the ones who didn't fear the devil because they carried him within. In the small German town of Bedburg, sometime in the late 16th century, lived a man who was known by all and truly understood by none. His name was Peter Stump, though history remembers him by a far more chilling title, the Werewolf of Bedburg. To his neighbors, Peter was a respected farmer, a man of some wealth, a father even. But at night, when the moon rose over the misty fields, something else stirred within him. According to the trial records, he confessed, under torture, of course, to a life that sounded torn between nightmare and legend. He claimed he made a pact with the devil, who gifted him a magical belt. When he wore it, he said, his body changed, his limbs twisted, fur grew thick on his skin, and his hunger turned animal, and not the kind of hunger that bread could satisfy. The people of Bedburg believed every word. Why wouldn't they? This was a time when wolves were not just beasts in the forest. They were symbols of everything untamed, everything sinful. When flocks were slaughtered, when children vanished, when screams carried across the night wind, it had to be the devil's work. And in Peter they found a perfect vessel for their fear. He was accused of killing livestock, of attacking travelers, of murdering his own kin. The records say he confessed to devouring his own son, to tearing flesh with his teeth, to drinking blood like wine. Whether those words were his or forced from him, we'll never know. But the village didn't wait for truth. They waited for fire. When Peter was finally captured, he was paraded through the town square, bound, bloodied, and broken. The crowd came not for justice, but for relief. They needed to see evil burned, to believe that once his ashes scattered, the night would finally grow quiet again. His body was tied to a wheel, his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, and finally his head cut from his body. Beside him, his mistress and daughter, accused of sharing his crimes, met the same fate. To the people of Bedburg, it wasn't execution, it was exorcism. And yet, centuries later, the story of Peter Stump still lingers. Not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. He was the embodiment of how fear shapes truth, how rumor becomes gospel, and how easily men of the Middle Ages mistook madness for monstrosity. You see, in those centuries, evil didn't always wear horns or hide in the dark forests. Sometimes it smiled at neighbors, tended to crops, and prayed in church on Sunday. And that's what makes these tales so haunting. Not the blood or the horror, but the reminder that some of the deadliest souls in history never thought of themselves as evil. The story of Peter Stump might sound like a wild medieval legend told by firelight, but it reflects something far more human. Fear disguised as faith, and cruelty disguised as justice. In the Middle Ages, the line between myth and reality wasn't a line at all. It was a fog, thick and shifting. And inside that fog, people found whatever truth comforted them most. In those centuries, everything was a sign. A storm wasn't just weather, it was God's anger. A sick cow meant sin in the household. A child born deformed was proof of a curse. When life itself was unpredictable, people searched desperately for patterns, and when patterns failed, they invented monsters. Wolves, witches, demons. They were all just shapes drawn on the mist to explain the chaos of being alive. Peter's story spread through Bedburg like wildfire because it gave that chaos a name. It allowed ordinary men to point and say, "There, that's evil." And it's not us, that's the quiet relief of every witch trial, every execution, every burning stake in history. It's not about truth, it's about comfort. And comfort in those times was worth more than mercy. But let's pause and imagine the world Peter lived in for a moment. Narrow dirt streets winding between wooden homes, the faint scent of tallow candles mixing with the rot of unwashed hides. In the distance, a bell tower calling the faithful to evening mass. Bedburg was no grand city. It was a handful of souls surrounded by forest. And to them, the forest was alive. It wasn't just a stretch of trees. It was a breathing, whispering thing. When night fell, wolves cried from the shadows, and branches snapped where no man walked. You can almost understand how quickly whispers turned to panic. One missing child became a story. 2 missing children became a curse. And by the time 3 or 4 disappeared, the village was ready to see monsters in their midst. When they finally caught Peter, it wasn't reason that led them. It was exhaustion. People were tired of fearing the dark. They needed closure, even if it meant inventing a villain. The irony is that Peter's confessions, the pact with the devil, the magic belt, were all pieces of theology the church itself had planted for centuries. He simply gave their sermons a face. After his death, the townsfolk rebuilt what they thought was order. They returned to their fields, their prayers, their rituals. But history tells us the killings didn't stop. The forests didn't grow silent, because it was never about one man or one monster. It was about an age of obsession, an era desperate to believe that evil was something you could tie to a stake and burn. Hundreds of miles away, similar stories began surfacing. A tailor in France accused of butchering children for meat pies. A baron in Scotland who, legend says, raised an entire family of cannibals. In each tale, the pattern repeats. Horror followed by hysteria, and hysteria by ritual cleansing. What's haunting is not the gore, but the simplicity. People of the Middle Ages believed they were protecting their souls. They thought fear could be purified by fire, and yet every act of purification left another scar on the human spirit. Modern historians often debate whether Peter Stump was truly guilty or simply the victim of a system that needed someone to blame. But if you read between the lines of the surviving pamphlets and confessions, you'll see something striking. A man who might have been mentally ill, delusional, or perhaps just misunderstood. And when you think about it that way, the werewolf of Bedburg becomes less of a monster and more of a mirror, because fear hasn't changed. We've just replaced wolves with headlines and pitchforks with comment sections. Every age finds its monsters, some in the woods, some in the world, and some within. And that's the quiet truth about the deadliest souls of the Middle Ages. They weren't born evil. They were shaped by famine, by faith, by fear. In a world where death was always at the door, morality became a survival game. People lied to priests, stole from neighbors, accused strangers, and prayed for forgiveness in the same breath. The Middle Ages were not a time of constant darkness. There was beauty, music, laughter too, but beneath that surface there pulsed a strange fascination with death. Cemeteries were playgrounds for sermons. Skulls decorated church walls. Monks wrote poetry about worms and decay. Life and death were inseparable companions, and for some souls, that line blurred too easily. Peter's story is just the first whisper of that world, a reminder that even the most ordinary people could be turned into legends of horror, simply because their world needed them to be. And in that sense, Bedburg wasn't unique. It was a reflection of medieval Europe itself, a continent balancing on the edge between faith and madness. By the time Peter Stump's ashes cooled, Europe had already found its next nightmare. Word of his execution drifted across the countryside like winter smoke, carried by merchants, monks, and gossiping travelers who fed on tales darker than hunger. And wherever that story landed, it sprouted echoes. Towns began to search their own streets, their own neighbors, wondering which face might be hiding the devil's touch. In the French province of Dauphiné, such whispers found a home. The land there was quiet, a scattering of villages pressed between misty hills and valleys of oak. It was the kind of place where every creak of a shutter sounded like a confession. Here, sometime in the mid-1600s, the name Jean Grenier began to slither through taverns and parish halls. A boy barely 16 who claimed that he too could change his skin. According to surviving records, Jean was small, timid, with pale hair, and eyes that never met yours for long. He told the priests that a shadowy figure had gifted him a wolf's hide. When he wrapped it around himself, he said, he could run on 4 legs, taste blood, and hunt children by moonlight. His victims, he swore, were those who wandered too far from home after dusk. To modern ears, it sounds like madness, a frightened child spinning stories to survive interrogation. But to the judges of the era, his words were proof enough. They called it lycanthropy, a sickness of the soul, a disease spread by sin. And yet, instead of burning Jean as they had burned Peter Stump, they locked him away in a monastery, where monks prayed over him until the end of his short, miserable life. What makes Grenier's story different is that it marks the slow turning of the age. The Church, for the first time, began to whisper that perhaps such confessions came not from pacts with the devil, but from sickness of the mind. The world, ever so slightly, began to shift from demonology to psychology, though it would take centuries more before mercy would outweigh fear. Still, the hunger for horror didn't fade. In villages untouched by education or science, people continued to craft legends around every unexplainable cruelty. When livestock were found mutilated, they spoke of shapeshifters. When travelers disappeared, they said bandits, then paused and added, or worse. And sometimes worse turned out to be true. Across the Pyrenees, in the forests of Navarre, another figure emerged, Gilles Garnier, remembered by locals as the werewolf of Dole. Garnier was no nobleman or scholar. He was a hermit who lived alone in the woods with his wife, surviving off whatever the forest surrendered. When famine struck, desperation followed. Children began to vanish again, and villagers found remains scattered near his hut. The pattern was familiar: suspicion, fear, and then a trial that was more theater than justice. Garnier confessed to hunting and eating his victims, saying he had been given an ointment by a spirit that let him transform into a wolf. Whether true or forced, the confession sealed his fate. He was burned alive before a crowd that believed they had purified their home. What ties these stories together isn't just blood or belief, it's loneliness. Each of these souls lived on the edges: a farmer in Bedburg, a boy in Dauphiné, a hermit in Dole. Isolation was the breeding ground of myth. When a man lived apart, people filled the silence around him with superstition. The less they knew of his heart, the easier it was to imagine claws beneath his skin. And so, the Middle Ages became a gallery of monsters, painted by fear. Some were real murderers, no doubt, driven by hunger or madness. But many were simply reflections of a society trying to explain cruelty without confronting itself. Because to admit that evil could live in our ordinary hearts was far more terrifying than believing in werewolves. Even the church, in its attempt to protect souls, often magnified the horror. Sermons warned peasants of demonic temptation. Artists painted the damned being devoured by beasts. Plays in the marketplace dramatized the confessions of killers, turning tragedy into entertainment. People watched, clutched their rosaries, and walked home beneath stars that suddenly looked too sharp. The medieval world was obsessed with order, yet every story of possession or lycanthropy reminded it how fragile that order truly was. Beneath the cross, beneath the crown, beneath the trembling prayers of the common man, there was always something wild, something ungoverned. That wildness is what this series of souls represents. Not just the killers themselves, but the fear they unleashed, a collective heartbeat racing against the dark. And perhaps, in a quiet way, that's why these tales still whisper to us today. They remind us that civilization is a thin veil. Behind it, the same shadows still move. So as you breathe slowly now, listening in the dim light of your room, imagine the sound of hooves on cobblestone, the faint growl of a wolf echoing through pines, and the anxious prayers of villagers huddled behind their doors. That was the sound of the Middle Ages falling asleep, never quite sure what would wake them. If you ever find yourself imagining the Middle Ages as a time of quiet faith and candlelit prayers, you'd only be half right. Because behind those prayers, there was screaming. Behind those churches, there were fires. And behind every sermon about salvation, there lurked the faint smell of burning flesh. It wasn't always the killers who filled the darkness. Sometimes it was the men who claimed to fight them. In an age when belief ruled stronger than law, justice wore a robe and carried a cross. To accuse someone of consorting with the devil was not an act of reason. It was an act of fear disguised as virtue. And once that accusation was spoken, there was no escaping it. The witch hunters of medieval Europe were not simple fanatics. They were bureaucrats of terror. They traveled from town to town with their manuals and crucifixes, cataloging sins the way merchants cataloged goods. There were entire professions built around discovering evil: inquisitors, confessors, exorcists, all convinced they were saving souls, even as they destroyed lives. They began, as all horrors do, with questions. Do you know anyone who dances under the moon? Have you ever seen your neighbor's cow sicken after her visit? Does your child speak to invisible friends? And for each yes, there followed a chain of suspicion that could wrap around an entire village. By the 15th century, even the smallest settlements kept lists. Names of women who smiled too much, of men who worked too late, of widows who healed the sick without a priest's blessing, all potential servants of the devil. One of the most infamous manuals of that age was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Written in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, it became the medieval world's best-selling guide to how to recognize, interrogate, and eliminate witches. It described how demons could seduce women, how witches could steal men's virility, how storms could be conjured by a whispered spell. But its most chilling passage wasn't about magic. It was about method. It detailed, step by step, how to extract a confession. The irony? Every confession, once tortured out of its victim, became proof that the book was right. Imagine a small stone room beneath a church, the air thick with candle smoke, the walls sweating from the heat of torches. Inside, a woman, a healer perhaps, or simply unlucky, bound to a wooden chair. Before her stands a man in robes, holding a crucifix in one hand and a quill in the other. He asks not questions of truth, but questions of expectation. He already knows the answers. He's just waiting for her to say them aloud. And when she does, through tears, through screams, she becomes the villain in her own story. By the time the witch trials reached their fever pitch in the 16th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands had been accused, and tens of thousands more had watched, helpless as their mothers, daughters, and neighbors were dragged to the stake. To be alive in those times was to live in a constant state of paranoia, where your own dreams could damn you and your silence could be taken as guilt. But perhaps the most haunting part of this entire era wasn't the violence itself. It was how ordinary it became. In Nuremberg, in Trier, in Essex, the executions became community events. Bells would toll, crowds would gather, markets would close for the day. Vendors sold bread and ale, while smoke rose from the town square. Children watched, priests prayed, and as the condemned screamed, the people convinced themselves that what they were hearing was purification, that these were the sounds of evil being erased from the earth. Yet history is cruel in its honesty. When you strip away the faith, the superstition, the politics, what remains are human beings, terrified, exhausted, desperate to believe they're on the right side of hell. And perhaps the cruelest truth of all, some of those inquisitors, the self-proclaimed saviors of Europe, were themselves fascinated by what they condemned. They kept trophies, strands of hair, written confessions, even ashes. They claimed it was for record keeping. But some records, when you read them now, feel too lovingly detailed, too indulgent in describing the pain. It's as if the line between punisher and monster had dissolved completely. When the night fell over medieval Europe, it wasn't just peasants who trembled. It was the very idea of goodness. Because what happens when evil hides behind prayer? When cruelty wears the face of piety? The deadliest souls of the Middle Ages weren't always the ones hunted. Sometimes they were the ones holding the torch. In the heart of the Middle Ages, Europe was drowning in a strange mix of light and darkness. Cathedrals were rising toward heaven, but beneath their holy shadows, people whispered about demons that walked like men. The human mind torn between salvation and sin, became a theater where obsession, faith, and fear performed their cruel play. And in that confusion, something monstrous was born. The holy killers, those who claimed they murdered for God. You see, the Middle Ages weren't just an age of knights and castles. They were an age of hysteria. A time when people believed that invisible hands of angels and devils guided every breath they took. A woman coughing in the wrong direction could be accused of witchcraft. A man with a strange dream could claim it was divine prophecy. And those who killed with conviction, those were sometimes called saints. There was one story whispered through the monasteries of France, the tale of Brother Guillaume, a monk who bathed in the blood of sinners. He was once a healer, or so people said. He wandered from village to village, carrying a small wooden cross and a pouch of herbs. He spoke softly, prayed loudly, and had eyes that never blinked for long. His words, people said, had the warmth of confession and the coldness of a grave. But something broke inside Guillaume when the plague came. Entire towns rotted, the dead were stacked like firewood, and priests refused to enter homes where the air smelled of death. Guillaume believed that sin had infected the world itself, that only purity could cleanse it. But his idea of purity was not what God ever intended. He began to purify the sick, starting with the dying. He would enter plague houses at night, touch their foreheads, and whisper prayers that always ended with silence. When the priests returned at dawn, they found the patients pale, eyes open, rosaries wrapped around stiff fingers. Some said Guillaume had mercy killed them. Others whispered that he drained their life with his own hands, convinced he was delivering their souls from torment. By the time the church caught him, Guillaume had written hundreds of pages describing his divine mission. They were filled with phrases like, "The blood sings to the heavens, and every cut is a hymn." When interrogated, he wept and claimed that angels stood behind him while he killed. They saw him as insane. But many peasants called him blessed, because in a world where everyone was dying anyway, a man who ended suffering seemed like a miracle. Even if his mercy came with a blade, the church burned his journals. But legends spread. Soon, imitators appeared, self-proclaimed monks who roamed the countryside, cleansing the impure. Some targeted the sick, others heretics, and others still women accused of temptation. The line between faith and fanaticism blurred into one long blood-stained prayer. And here's the most terrifying part. They weren't all mad. Many of them were intelligent, educated, even charismatic. They didn't see themselves as killers. They saw themselves as surgeons of sin, cutting rot from the world before it spread further. Their victims were not people in their eyes, just vessels too damaged to save. In the medieval mind, the idea of killing for faith wasn't entirely shocking. The Crusades had already baptized the sword in the name of God. People saw holy war as divine duty, and sin as an infection that could spread faster than any plague. It's strange. The same faith that built the grand cathedrals also justified rivers of blood. Guillaume's story echoed centuries later in confessionals, sermons, and nightmares. Some said his ghost still wandered the cloisters, whispering prayers over the sleeping monks. Some even claimed they saw him during the Black Death, a hooded figure standing at the edge of villages, humming hymns while the sick screamed inside their homes. But this obsession with purging evil from others led to an even darker kind of killer, the one who turned his eyes inward, who believed that suffering could make him pure. They were not killers of others, but of themselves. These were the flagellants, the marching armies of self-torture. During the 14th century, thousands of men and women walked barefoot through Europe, whipping their backs until the streets ran red. They sang hymns through tears, believing every lash on their skin erased a sin from the world. Town after town they came, naked from the waist up, chanting, bleeding, collapsing. People knelt before them, weeping, begging for blessings from these human rivers of pain. But hidden among them were darker souls, men who found pleasure in the blood, men who took their flagellation too far. They stopped praying and started hunting others, forcing them to join their rituals, punishing non-believers with the lash. Whole villages feared the sound of their drums. Some say they crucified those who refused to repent, and when plague or famine struck, it was these wandering zealots who were first blamed or sometimes praised for God's fury. It was a madness disguised as piety, a cruelty baptized in incense and candlelight. Everywhere you turned in the medieval world, death had a sermon to preach. The gallows stood beside the church. The cemetery surrounded the chapel. The smell of incense mixed with rot. Faith and fear were not enemies. They were lovers, holding hands in the dark. And that, perhaps, was the greatest horror of the Middle Ages, that good and evil were not separate things, but reflections in the same mirror. The same hand that blessed could also kill, believing it was doing holy work. In every age, power has a strange smell, a mix of wine, sweat, and fear. But in the Middle Ages, that smell was heavier. It was the scent of blood soaked into velvet robes. The kings and queens of those centuries were not merely rulers. They were living gods in the eyes of their people. And when gods go mad, the world learns to bleed quietly. The medieval throne was a fragile thing. It didn't rest on loyalty or love. It rested on paranoia. Every crown was a circle of iron thorns, and to wear it meant watching every shadow, every whisper, every glass of wine poured too slowly. In the glow of candlelight, where courtiers smiled with trembling lips, mercy was weakness, and suspicion was survival. Let's begin in France, in the winter of 1392. The torches burned dim that night, their smoke thick as breath on a cold mirror. King Charles VI sat alone, his crown tilted slightly on his sweating head. Outside, wolves howled. Inside, something howled too. But it wasn't an animal. It was the sound of his own mind unraveling. Charles was called Charles the Beloved once, until his madness turned him into Charles the Mad. One summer morning, he woke up screaming that his courtiers were demons. By noon, he had murdered 4 of them with his sword. For days, he refused to bathe or speak. He believed his body was made of glass, that if anyone touched him, he would shatter into pieces. And yet, he ruled. He signed decrees, ordered executions, and demanded feasts, while bodies of the possessed rotted in dungeons below. His queen, Isabeau, tried to hide the truth, that France was ruled by a ghost trapped inside a man. But the whispers grew louder. They said the king's fits were punishments from God. Others said the devil whispered in his ear. No one dared to correct him. No one dared to look too long into his eyes, where sanity flickered like a dying candle. When he smiled, people prayed, because a smile from Charles the Mad meant someone, somewhere, would die by morning. But madness was not the only monster that hid behind royal curtains. There were kings whose cruelty was cold, measured, like accountants of agony. Take Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. Centuries before he became the myth of Dracula, Vlad was a prince raised in captivity, taught by enemies, scarred by betrayal. When he finally reclaimed his throne, he returned not as a ruler, but as vengeance incarnate. He believed terror was stronger than armies, so he built his kingdom upon fear. His favorite punishment was impalement, a slow, deliberate death, where a sharpened stake entered through the body and lifted the victim like a grotesque flag. They say the forests of Wallachia looked like fields of dying men. Birds nested in their hair. The wind whistled through their open mouths. Vlad would dine among them, dipping bread in wine as screams echoed across the hills. To him, this was order, divine justice. Every stake, he said, was a sermon. And yet, his people worshipped him. Merchants said his roads were the safest in Europe. Thieves vanished overnight. Peasants spoke of him with trembling respect, not because they loved him, but because they feared what came after disobedience. In a strange way, his cruelty kept the peace. That's the paradox of medieval power. Sometimes evil preserved stability better than virtue ever could. But not all royal killers ruled from castles. Some wore innocence like perfume, smiling sweetly while they orchestrated death. Like Elizabeth Bathory, the blood countess of Hungary, a woman of wealth, beauty, and education. She could speak 5 languages, read the Bible fluently, and compose music. Yet behind her elegant gowns and sweet voice, she harbored an obsession that would stain her name forever. It began, they say, with a servant girl, a simple mistake, a torn piece of fabric. Elizabeth struck her, and when blood splattered on her hand, she noticed how soft her skin looked afterward. It was madness, but a madness wrapped in silk. Soon she began bathing in the blood of virgins, believing it would preserve her youth. Her castle became a labyrinth of screams, hidden rooms, and false walls. Girls were lured in with promises of work, then vanished forever. Servants whispered that at night the countess walked the halls barefoot, trailing red footprints. When the authorities finally raided her castle, they found corpses frozen in grotesque positions. Some drained, some burned, some nailed to the walls like warnings. Elizabeth didn't deny it. She only said calmly, "Every beauty must feed on something." Even after her imprisonment, she was never executed because she was nobility. Instead, she was bricked into a room with only a slit to pass food through. For 4 years, she sat alone in the dark, surrounded by silence and ghosts of her own creation. Her story spread like fire through Europe, and among peasants, she became a myth, a cautionary tale. But for nobles, she was something more dangerous, a mirror, because deep down, every royal house had its secrets, children hidden, rivals missing, servants silenced. The higher you rose in power, the quieter your victims became. One of the most chilling stories came from England under King Richard III. When his brother died, Richard became Lord Protector for his young nephews, the 2 princes in the Tower of London. But soon both boys vanished. No records, no witnesses, no graves, just silence. Years later, skeletons of 2 children were found beneath the stones. Whether they were the princes or not, no one ever proved. But history remembered the king as a murderer, a ruler who killed his own blood to keep his throne. And yet, centuries later, some historians argued he might have been innocent, that he was merely a victim of propaganda. That's the cruel trick of history. Killers wear crowns, but so do heroes. The difference depends on who writes the story. The medieval world was built on that blurred line. Kings slaughtered thousands in the name of peace. Queens ordered poisonings and called it protection. In their minds, morality was a luxury only the poor could afford. When the common man killed, he was a sinner. When the noble killed, he was maintaining order. And in between those two truths, the world learned to keep quiet. In dimly lit banquet halls, while musicians played soft lutes and goblets clinked, someone always disappeared by dawn. The court jester laughed, too loudly, too long, because he knew laughter was safer than honesty. And somewhere behind the curtains, a queen's hand tightened on a jeweled dagger, the blade reflecting the candlelight like a tear. Royalty in the Middle Ages was a masquerade of holiness, a dance where every smile hid suspicion, and every blessing could become a curse. They ruled not by love, but by the illusion of divine right, and if anyone doubted that illusion, they simply vanished. By the time the 14th century settled over Europe, the air itself seemed haunted. Smoke from endless wars mixed with the incense of cathedrals, and everywhere bells rang not just for prayer, but for death. The Middle Ages had reached a fever pitch, a time when every soul believed the devil was not lurking in hell, but walking beside them, wearing human skin. It was an age of confession and cruelty, where sin was measured not by what you did, but by what your neighbor whispered about you. And in this world, faith could save you or destroy you. The church was power, greater than kings, deeper than any sword. Priests spoke not to men, but to eternity, and when they condemned someone, that person's soul was already burning. But as the centuries grew darker, faith began to twist. The sermons turned from salvation to suspicion. If crops failed, it was witchcraft. If a child fell ill, it was sorcery. If a woman lived alone, she was in league with demons. Truth became whatever frightened the village the most. In a small German town near Trier, a winter like no other swept through, cold enough to freeze rivers, cruel enough to make people turn on each other. That's when the first whispers began. A baker's wife miscarried 3 times. A shepherd's flock died overnight. And suddenly, everyone knew why. An old widow named Greta, who lived by the forest's edge. She owned a black cat, she prayed alone, and she smiled at strange hours. It was enough. The townsfolk came with torches and scripture. They tied her to a post, asked her to confess her pact with Satan, and when she didn't, they called her silence proof. Greta screamed once, then never again. The next day, it snowed so hard, the whole town vanished under white. For weeks, no one spoke of her, but soon more names followed, men, women, even children. The fever of fear spread faster than plague. Priests kept records, nobles signed warrants, and the church's dungeons filled with trembling souls who didn't even understand what they were accused of. From 1450 to 1750, tens of thousands across Europe were burned, drowned, or crushed, all in the name of purity. The witch hunts weren't just punishment, they were entertainment. Market squares turned into theaters of agony. The crowd cheered as smoke rose, believing they were watching sin leave the world in flames. They didn't realize they were feeding it. Every cry, every execution, was fuel for the fire that devoured their own humanity. And yet, the killers were convinced they were holy. That's what made it terrifying. The men who tortured women into confessing imaginary crimes prayed afterward for forgiveness and believed they had done God's work. In the dim candlelight of the Inquisition chambers, Monks wrote down names while blood dripped from wooden tables. One inquisitor, Father Conrad, was known for his devotion. He fasted daily, never smiled, and carried a rosary of bones, each bead carved from the finger of a condemned soul. He said it reminded him that faith must be fed to stay alive. Conrad's story became legend, a man so obsessed with eradicating evil that he became its reflection. When he died, his fellow monks swore his body wouldn't decay. They placed him in a tomb under the abbey, and for years pilgrims came to touch the stone, praying for protection from witches. But one night, a thief tried to rob the crypt. When the tomb was opened, Conrad's body was gone. The only thing left was his rosary, its bone beads freshly cracked, as if chewed from within. Such stories blurred the line between religion and madness. The medieval soul was trapped between terror of hell and terror of earth. It wasn't just priests who killed. Entire villages joined in, convinced they were saving themselves. In Switzerland, a farmer named Hensley confessed to dancing with demons under the moon, not because it was true, but because he had been kept awake for 10 nights, beaten until his mind broke. His confession led to 40 more arrests. The chain reaction continued for decades, each lie birthing another fire. The irony was brutal. While peasants burned for witchcraft, nobles dined with astrologers and alchemists, performing their own secret rituals behind marble walls. Kings consulted seers before war. Queens drank potions made from ground pearls and powdered bone. The same church that condemned magic quietly sold relics, splinters of the true cross, drops of the Virgin's milk, feathers from Gabriel's wings, all fake, all blessed with profit. Faith had become theater, sin had become currency. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the Middle Ages wasn't the killings. It was how quickly people forgot. Villages erased names, churches burned trial records, and soon history itself began to look clean again. No one wanted to remember the smell of burning hair, the sound of prayers dissolving into screams. Humanity has a habit of burying its guilt, not 6 feet under, but beneath silence. Yet not everyone forgot. Some chroniclers, hidden scribes working under candlelight, recorded everything. They wrote in codes using ink made from soot and blood. Their scrolls told of women who were innocent, of inquisitors who laughed while lighting torches, of priests who stole from the dying. These secret histories survived only in fragments, scattered across monasteries and forgotten libraries. And when archaeologists began finding them centuries later, they realized something chilling. The handwriting on several anonymous scrolls matched the records of the inquisitors themselves. It meant that even monsters sometimes knew they were monsters. They couldn't stop the killing, but maybe they wanted to be remembered, not as saints, but as warnings. The deeper you travel into the Middle Ages, the clearer it becomes that darkness wasn't a place or a moment. It was a habit. People learned to live beside it, to justify it, even to love it. A mother teaching her child to pray might have once cheered for a burning. A knight swearing loyalty might have poisoned his brother. A monk copying scripture might have screamed confessions from someone's lips the night before. Morality wasn't a line then. It was a circle, and everyone walked it until they found themselves back in the fire. At night, when bells tolled across valleys, some said the sound wasn't calling to prayer. It was calling the dead. The forests around old execution sites grew thicker, darker, richer, as if fed by what humanity left behind. Travelers whispered that sometimes, if you walked alone at dusk, You could still hear the chanting of long-gone inquisitors, the soft crack of rope, the hiss of fire. And in the heart of those whispers lies the greatest irony of all. The Middle Ages feared evil more than any other era. And yet, it was evil that gave it its shape. Without fear, the faith would have crumbled. Without sin, the saints would have had no meaning. Without witches, priests would have had no purpose. The world needed its monsters, because without them, it would have to face its own reflection. There's something far more terrifying than a killer in a crown. And that's a killer who looks like everyone else. In the medieval world, where most men worked the land and most women prayed for food, death came in simple clothes. No royal decree, no holy inquisition, just hunger, jealousy, or madness hiding in the eyes of a neighbor. The Middle Ages were filled with faces that never made it into history books. But behind those faces, entire nightmares waited. Imagine a small village somewhere in England around the year 1310. The roads are mud, the air smells of smoke and bread, and church bells echo faintly over the hills. The peasants wake at dawn, their hands already blistered, their backs bent. They live by sunlight and die by winter, yet even in that rhythm of toil and prayer, something darker beats beneath the surface, an ancient hum of violence that has no name, only instinct. It begins with famine. A crop fails. The lord of the manor raises taxes to cover his losses. Desperation spreads faster than plague, and in that hunger, morality begins to rot. Mothers hide food from their children. Farmers steal from their neighbors. And somewhere between prayer and survival, someone decides that another person's life is worth less than a loaf of bread. There was a chronicler named Brother Osric who once wrote, "In times of plenty, men are brothers. In times of hunger, men are wolves." He wasn't exaggerating. Archaeologists digging in abandoned medieval villages found human bones with knife marks, not from battles, but from kitchens. Cannibalism wasn't always ritual. Sometimes it was economy. Flesh became a form of currency when the fields turned barren. The church never spoke of it, but whispers in the taverns told otherwise, of travelers disappearing on stormy nights, of stew that smelled a little too sweet, of markets where meat came wrapped in cloth instead of honesty. Then there were the soldiers, mercenaries without masters. When wars ended, they didn't vanish. They drifted, hungry for gold or blood. It didn't matter which came first. They roamed from village to village, offering protection for coin and destruction for fun. The chronicles called them the free companies, but there was nothing free about them. They brought ruin wherever they went. One such band, led by a man named Gautier the Pale, became infamous across France. He was said to laugh like a child while burning barns, to bless himself before cutting a man's throat, and to sing psalms after slaughter. He claimed he wasn't evil, only efficient. His men called him the White Saint, because after battle, his armor gleamed spotless. When the plague came, these soldiers found new work, not fighting men, but robbing corpses. They would break into plague houses at night, take jewelry off the dead, sometimes even food from the sick, and in a twisted way, the people accepted it. In the chaos of pestilence, when death walked every street, killers became part of the scenery. In London, the river carried more secrets than boats. The Thames was not just water, it was a mirror of filth, a dumping ground for sins. Fishermen often found more than fish tangled in their nets. Whole families vanished without a word, and no one asked questions because everyone was afraid of finding the answers. Some said the fog hid spirits. Others whispered that there were gangs of cutters who prowled the docks, killing travelers for shoes or bread. The city guard didn't bother to investigate. Life was cheap, and silence was cheaper. Then there were the midwives and healers, women who lived on the edges of villages, knowing too much about herbs and death. People came to them in secret, for medicine, for abortions, for love potions, and feared them in daylight. Many were harmless, but some weren't. One account from a monastery near Milan tells of a midwife named Agnes who helped deliver children, and sometimes ended their lives. She claimed it was mercy. The plague had left too many mouths to feed, she said. When they found her home, they discovered jars of dried herbs, vials of strange liquid, and tiny bones buried under the floorboards. The priest who buried her wrote in the margins of his Bible, "Even the gentlest hands can learn to cradle death." But it wasn't just desperation that turned people into monsters. Sometimes it was belief. In Bohemia, there lived a man named Luca, a shepherd who thought he heard the voice of angels. He said they told him the world was ending, that sinners must be purified before sunrise. He started with his family. When villagers found his house, they found them all. Wife, 3 children, even the dog, their throats cut, their hands folded in prayer. Luca sat outside, humming a hymn, his clothes soaked in blood. He said he had saved them from the devil. The town priest blessed him, then buried the dead in consecrated ground. No one called him a murderer. They called him faithful. That's the frightening part of medieval horror. How easy it was to make sense of madness. Every act of cruelty could be justified by hunger or faith or fear. And when the world finally realized it was drowning in its own blood, it was already too late, because death had become normal. It didn't need dungeons or thrones anymore. It lived in every field, every cottage, every trembling hand that prayed for forgiveness while holding a knife. Even the children weren't untouched. In a chronicle from Spain, a monk describes finding a group of orphaned boys who lived in the ruins of an old monastery. They survived by robbing travelers, and when winter came, they turned to darker means. One of them kept the others alive by leading victims into the catacombs, pretending to show them holy relics. He would slit their throats and feed the bodies to dogs. When caught, he was only 10 years old. The monk who recorded it ended his note with a line that still chills the spine. "The devil does not make men. He waits for them to make themselves." And so the centuries passed. The killers changed faces. The villages changed names. But the fear remained the same. The Middle Ages weren't defined by swords or crowns. They were defined by what lived in silence. In every tavern, every farmhouse, every dimly lit chapel, there were secrets no prayer could wash away. People thought the devil haunted them, but perhaps he didn't have to. Perhaps they were enough. By the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe began to see itself as reborn, cleaner, wiser, more civilized. But underneath the polished marble and the art of New Ages, the soil was still rich with old bones. For every new cathedral that rose, 100 forgotten graves remained underfoot. The world had changed, but its shadow hadn't. It merely learned how to hide better. The air in medieval Europe carried a strange weight, a mix of incense from the church, the smell of tanned hides, wood smoke, and something else. Something that hinted at the hidden rot beneath civilization's surface. For while priests preached salvation and nobles threw feasts under candlelight, There were always those who walked unseen, figures who fed on the very heartbeat of humanity. To understand the deadliest souls of the Middle Ages, you must set aside the romantic notions of chivalry and castles, and instead step into the narrow alleys of forgotten towns, where a single scream could vanish into the fog without anyone daring to open their window. One such figure drifted through those shadows like a rumor come to life, a man known in whispers as Gilles de Rais. At first, he was the picture of medieval nobility, a companion of Joan of Arc, a celebrated knight who rode under the banner of faith and glory. People bowed when he passed, his armor gleaming, his banner proud. Yet behind those saintly colors lay a heart darker than the dungeons beneath his own castle walls. After the wars ended, after the glory faded, something inside him cracked. Perhaps madness, perhaps boredom, or perhaps the weight of divine disillusionment. He turned inward, searching for pleasure, control, and power in the only way his decaying soul could imagine. He began with servants, the ones too poor to be missed. Then came the children of peasants, lured into his grand castle with promises of food, work, or shelter. What awaited them inside was a theater of cruelty so horrifying that even centuries later it feels impossible to comprehend. The chambers of his home became a stage for his obsessions, torture, ritual, and the slow unraveling of innocence. Yet he prayed before every act, believing somehow that his nobility shielded him from divine judgment. His crimes went unnoticed for years, not because people were blind, but because no one dared accuse a lord. In the Middle Ages, power was not just wealth, it was immunity. But power has limits, even for the damned. When bodies began to vanish in nearby villages, whispers turned to suspicion. A wandering priest, noticing the pattern of disappearances, dared to speak against Gilles. Soon the Duke's soldiers came knocking. What they found in his castle defied reason. Bones, chains, and strange ritual markings on the walls. It was said that even hardened men refused to enter those chambers again, and when Gilles finally stood trial, he confessed everything, not out of guilt, but out of pride, as if each act of horror were a twisted badge of honor. He was hanged in 1440, and his body was burned, but his name lingered, not as a noble knight, but as one of history's earliest recorded serial killers. Yet Gilles de Rais was not alone in his descent into darkness. Across Europe, from the damp corners of France to the frozen plains of Germany, others walked the same cursed path. The Middle Ages were a perfect breeding ground for monsters, not mythical ones, but human ones. The chaos of war, the superstition, the lack of law, all created a world where evil could hide in plain sight. Take, for instance, the case of Peter Niers, a figure so infamous that his name still echoes through old German folklore. He was a traveler, a beggar, a thief, but beneath that disguise lay something far more sinister. Over the course of decades, he was said to have murdered more than 500 people, performing grotesque rituals with their remains. It was believed that he carried the hearts of unborn children as talismans to make himself invisible, a horrifying detail that blurred the line between myth and truth. And yet, to the frightened peasants who lived in isolated villages, it all felt real. Peter Niers became a legend of terror, a man who could appear anywhere, who slipped through walls, who wore faces not his own. Some said he learned black magic from the devil himself. When he was finally captured, the world rejoiced, But even his execution became a spectacle of medieval cruelty. He was tortured for days, his body broken piece by piece, and yet, until his final breath, he never begged for mercy. To many, it was not justice but ritual, the living trying to purge the evil they had allowed to grow among them. And through it all, a chilling thought remains. How many more like him walked the same roads, unnoticed, unpunished, unseen? For every monster who was caught, how many disappeared into the fog, blending once more into the ordinary crowds of the Middle Ages? Not all killers of the medieval world were cloaked in nobility or legend. Some were far quieter, their horrors woven into the routine of daily life. The butcher, the midwife, the neighbor who smiled too easily. The towns of the Middle Ages were small, close-knit, and yet strangely blind. You could live next door to a murderer for years and never suspect a thing. The thin line between sin and survival was constantly shifting. And morality was often just a story told by whoever had the most power. In the fog-covered town of Bedburg, Germany, a man named Peter Stump, or as history remembers him, the werewolf of Bedburg, became one of Europe's most feared figures. To the people of his time, he wasn't just a killer, he was something unholy. Stump's story spread like wildfire, a mix of fact and superstition that still sends chills down the spine. He was a farmer, a widower, a man who blended seamlessly with his village. But when livestock began disappearing and children were found torn apart near the fields, whispers of witchcraft filled the air. They said he could transform into a wolf, that he wore a belt made by the devil himself, which gave him the strength and hunger of a beast. Of course, in the modern world, it's easy to dismiss these stories as folklore or mass hysteria. But the truth beneath them is far more human and far more terrifying. When Stump was captured, the evidence wasn't of sorcery, but of cold, deliberate murder. He confessed to killing men, women, and children, more than a dozen in all, claiming he was driven by uncontrollable urges. What's chilling is that his words, written in old German court records, don't sound like those of a possessed man. They sound like a person fully aware of what he had done, someone who enjoyed the power that came from taking life. His trial was public, brutal, and deeply symbolic. The church declared him a servant of Satan, and he was executed not as a man, but as a monster. They tore him apart, piece by piece, before setting his body ablaze. To the terrified villagers, it was justice. To historians, it was a glimpse into something older, the medieval mind's desperate need to make sense of evil. Because to accept that such darkness could exist in an ordinary man, that was too unbearable. It was easier to believe he was a werewolf. But Peter Stump was just one of many. Across the Channel, in England, a woman named Elizabeth Bathory earned her place among the deadliest souls of her age. Though she lived slightly later, in the 16th and early 17th centuries, her legend grew from the same medieval soil of blood, fear, and faith. Bathory was a noblewoman, wealthy, powerful, and untouchable. Yet behind the grand gates of her castle, she built her own theater of horror. Servant girls entered to serve their lady and never came out again. According to testimony, Bathory believed that bathing in the blood of virgins would keep her young forever. The idea seems almost too grotesque to believe, but in an age obsessed with purity and divine beauty, perhaps it made a twisted kind of sense. Witnesses spoke of torture chambers hidden behind the walls of her estate. rooms where screams echoed against cold stone, while snow fell silently outside. Some accounts claim she murdered more than 600 girls. Whether the number is exaggerated or not, what matters is the truth at its heart, that she used her power, her class, and the silence of her servants to commit acts that would make even the cruelest warlord flinch. When the crown finally moved against her, Bathory wasn't executed. Instead, she was sealed inside her own castle, bricked into a room with no windows, left to die slowly in the dark. Her crimes were too scandalous to speak of openly, her name too noble to be shouted in public trials, and so, like many of her victims, she vanished into silence. These were the monsters of flesh and blood, killers who walked among the living and hid behind faces of normalcy. But what made the Middle Ages particularly haunting wasn't just the cruelty of individuals, it was how easily society itself allowed them to exist. There were no detectives, no newspapers, no real justice. The world was ruled by whispers and suspicion, and fear was the closest thing they had to law enforcement. Imagine walking home through a medieval town at night, your footsteps echoing on cobblestone streets, torches flickering on the walls, shadows stretching like claws across the ground. Somewhere in that darkness, someone is watching. Maybe it's a thief, maybe it's a desperate peasant, or maybe, just maybe, it's one of those deadliest souls waiting for the perfect moment to step out of legend and into your life. The Middle Ages were drenched in faith, yet haunted by something that faith could never quite cleanse. In every cathedral stood a statue of mercy, but in every dungeon someone screamed in silence. People feared the devil, yes, but they also feared themselves, the shadow within that no prayer could banish. You see, this was an age obsessed with sin, with salvation, with the invisible war between light and darkness. And perhaps that's why so many monsters thrived. Because when a society spends every waking moment thinking about good and evil, it begins to summon both in equal measure. Superstition ruled where reason failed. A crop failure, the devil's work. A child sick with fever, a curse, a missing neighbor, a witch. In such a world where fear filled every corner, evil could hide in plain sight, wrapped in religious robes or disguised as divine punishment. The line between faith and madness blurred, and sometimes the same church bells that called people to prayer also tolled for those accused of ungodly crimes. Among the chilling records that survived, few are as unnerving as those involving inquisitors, men who believed they were serving God by purging sin through pain. Many of these inquisitors were not killers in the traditional sense. They didn't stalk alleys or hunt prey. Instead, they built chambers of torment where the condemned confessed to sins they never committed. In their minds, torture was mercy, for to cleanse a soul through agony was to save it from eternal fire. How many innocent lives were crushed beneath that twisted logic? We'll never know. The Church's own records are full of confessions, each one signed under the weight of unbearable suffering. And yet, the paradox of the Middle Ages lies here. The same world that produced saints also produced sadists. Both claimed to serve the same God. Take Conrad von Marburg, a priest whose zeal burned so bright it scorched everything in its path. He roamed Germany in the early 13th century, a self-declared hunter of heretics. Wherever he went, fear followed. He accused nobles, priests, and peasants alike, anyone who dared look upon him with doubt. They said he carried a list of the damned longer than his own sermons. His trials were short, his verdicts brutal, and his gallows always busy. When his superiors finally demanded he provide evidence for his claims, Conrad refused, and before he could be tried himself, he was found murdered on a lonely road. Some called it divine justice, others called it irony. But beyond the courts and cathedrals, darkness found other ways to thrive. In art, in medicine, even in science. Medieval physicians experimented with the boundaries of life and death, often blurring them beyond recognition. Anatomy, after all, required bodies. And where would one find them? In graveyards, freshly dug. It was not uncommon for students of science to pay grave robbers to deliver corpses under the cover of night. In some cases, the surgeons themselves took part in the digging. The pursuit of knowledge, noble as it was, often carried the stench of decay. And what of the people? What of the peasants who tilled the fields by day and barred their doors by night? Their world was small, a circle of light surrounded by endless darkness. They believed in saints, in relics, in miracles, but also in demons that whispered through the cracks of their homes. To them, every tragedy was personal, every evil nearby. They didn't think of serial killers the way we do now, with names and motives and profiles. To them, these people were not killers. They were curses. It's easy, from the comfort of our modern world, to look back and wonder how they could live surrounded by such horror. But perhaps the real question is this: did they truly live in more darkness than we do now? Or were they simply more honest about it? They believed that evil wore a face, that sin had a name, and so they hunted it, exorcised it, burned it. We, on the other hand, have given it subtler disguises: power, greed, progress. As the candlelight flickers against stone walls, imagine the echo of boots down an empty corridor, a torch sputtering in the cold air. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls midnight. The world sleeps uneasily, and in that uneasy sleep, shadows stir. The same shadows that have always been with us, waiting for the next soul brave enough to look them in the eye. History tends to polish its villains until they almost sparkle, transforming them into tragic figures or misunderstood souls. But the truth of the Middle Ages is far less poetic. Evil was not elegant. It was filthy, raw, and human. It hid beneath fingernails and inside hearts that once beat with love and laughter. Every village had its rumors. Every town had a story of a man or woman who went too far. And somewhere between myth and memory, those stories hardened into legends. One such legend was that of Tugbert, a wandering pilgrim who appeared in France during a time of famine. No one knew where he came from, only that wherever he went, death followed. He was soft-spoken, courteous even, and carried a wooden rosary that he never seemed to prey upon. Peasants offered him bread, travelers shared fires with him, and priests blessed his journey. But then, livestock began vanishing. Children disappeared. Wells were found tainted. He was gone before anyone could accuse him. Only the faint sound of his walking stick echoing through the fog. It wasn't until years later that his crimes surfaced, pieced together from town records and confessions of captured accomplices. He had been part of a secret wandering cult, one that believed consuming human flesh granted divine protection from plague and starvation. Their victims were the weak, the starving, the forgotten. And so, in a world already drowning in death, they found ways to feed on it. Authorities eventually caught Bear, but his trial was brief. Under torture, he described their rituals in chilling detail, naming others scattered across Europe. The church destroyed most of those records, calling them too disturbing for the public to know. But fragments survived, enough to remind us that even faith can be twisted when desperation becomes a religion. Then there was the Piper of Lübeck, whose story, like a haunting melody, drifts between fable and fact. In the late 1200s, the town of Lübeck in northern Germany was struck by famine and disease. Children vanished overnight, and the townsfolk spoke of a man with a strange pipe who had walked through the market square that very evening. He wasn't dressed like a musician, nor did his tunes sound like anything they'd heard before. Some said it was joyful, others mournful, but all agreed that those who heard it followed. They never returned. Centuries later, chroniclers connected this tale with others, from Hamelin to Bremen, suggesting that the piper may have been no spirit at all, but a human predator taking advantage of chaos. Wars, famines, and plagues displaced thousands of children across Europe. Entire groups disappeared from records. It's possible that someone, or several someones, exploited this despair, luring the lost into slavery or death. But for the towns that endured it, such horror needed a reason beyond human greed. And so they gave it a face, a piper in colorful clothes, leading innocence into the dark. Even outside Europe's cities, the countryside held its share of secrets. Travelers spoke of lonely inns where guests checked in but never left. The Inn of the Red Lanterns, perched along the trade road between Paris and Lyon, became infamous for its disappearances. Merchants would rest there for the night, their wagons full of silk or spices, and by morning both merchant and cargo were gone. Locals whispered about a couple who ran the inn, a smiling husband and a soft-spoken wife. Their charm was disarming, their food excellent. But when a storm flooded the nearby fields one spring, a group of workers unearthed a pit behind the tavern. Inside lay dozens of skeletons, each stripped of rings, purses, and boots. The innkeepers were gone. Some say they were caught and hanged under false names miles away. Others say they escaped, vanishing into history like so many others who had learned how to feed quietly on the world around them. What binds all these tales together is not just their cruelty, but their ordinariness. The Middle Ages were a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of humanity, without pretense. And for every cathedral built to glorify heaven, there was a cellar somewhere echoing the cries of the damned. Yet, these horrors didn't only shape medieval minds, they reshaped Europe itself. As towns grew and kingdoms stabilized, the constant presence of unseen killers forced society to invent things we now take for granted. Patrol guards, town watches, curfews, even rudimentary forms of criminal investigation. Fear, in its strange way, gave birth to order. But one truth remains unchanged across centuries. Evil does not vanish. It evolves. It learns new manners, new disguises. In the Middle Ages, it wore a cloak and carried a torch. Today, it may wear a suit and carry a smile. The faces change, but the shadow stays the same. In the medieval imagination, evil wasn't just something a person did. It was something a person became. To sin was one thing. To be consumed by it was another. And so, when stories of murderers and monsters spread through taverns or across monastery walls, they were rarely told as mere crimes. They were lessons, warnings, mirrors held up to remind people that the devil didn't live far away. He lived next door, inside a neighbor, inside the self. To understand how the Middle Ages dealt with their darkness, you have to look at how they believed the world worked. Every action had cosmic weight. Every choice tugged at the balance between heaven and hell. A storm wasn't just weather, it was a message. A plague wasn't just disease, it was punishment. And when a person committed unspeakable acts, people didn't see them as human anymore. They saw them as portals, openings through which hell itself reached into the world. This belief shaped everything, from how justice was carried out to how history was written. Executions were not just punishment, they were purification rituals. When a murderer was burned at the stake, it wasn't to destroy the body. It was to destroy the evil that had taken root inside it. The crackling fire, the smell of smoke, the prayers of the priests, all of it was theater for the soul, meant to reassure the terrified public that balance had been restored. But deep down, everyone knew. For every sinner burned, 10 more were waiting in the shadows. Perhaps that's why medieval people were so obsessed with confession. They needed words, a way to name the darkness before it consumed them. Confession manuals from the 14th century read like grim inventories of human nature: theft, lust, envy, murder. They even listed secret killings, crimes so unspeakable the priests themselves weren't supposed to repeat them aloud. Imagine the weight of those secrets, echoing through the dim chambers of monasteries, whispered in trembling voices to men who believed their own souls might rot just from hearing them. And then there were the chroniclers, the medieval writers who recorded everything from royal weddings to mass executions. They wrote with a strange mixture of horror and fascination, trying to make sense of what they witnessed. Some described killers as plagues in human form. Others said they were proof of the devil's patience. But the most chilling accounts are those that don't sound shocked at all. They simply list events, one after another, as if murder and faith were both ordinary parts of the same world. Because in a way, they were. Life was short, brutal, and uncertain, and when death lurked in every shadow, even horror became familiar. Still, amid all the darkness, a strange kind of understanding emerged. Some medieval thinkers began to see evil not as divine punishment, but as something deeply human. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued that sin was not a monster lurking outside. It was a distortion of something good inside us. Pride twisted into arrogance. Hunger turned into greed. Desire into cruelty. These were not demons. They were people, and people could choose. It was a radical idea for its time, one that planted the earliest seeds of what we now call psychology. But that understanding did little to comfort those who lived through the terror. A child found missing, a neighbor accused, a stranger arriving in town. Every event became a small tremor in the collective fear that something larger, something unseen, was always watching. In the winter months, when nights stretched endlessly and winds howled through empty fields, villagers huddled close to their fires, whispering the old stories once more. The same stories we whisper now, of killers, ghosts, and the darkness that never truly leaves. What's fascinating is that the deeper you go into these medieval tales, the less they're about blood and death, and the more they're about control. Who has it? Who loses it? And what happens when you realize that even the purest faith can't keep the darkness away forever? The truth is, the Middle Ages were not uniquely evil. They were simply more honest about what we still try to hide, that humanity's greatest monster has always been itself. And maybe that's why these stories still haunt us. Because in every whispered legend of a medieval killer, there's an echo of something we recognize, a reflection, a warning that the shadows of the past were never really left behind. They just learned how to blend in with the light. And so, as we drift through the fading embers of this night's journey, we begin to see the truth that hides behind all the legends. That darkness has never really belonged to one time or one place. It walks beside humanity like a shadow that never quite leaves, changing its mask, changing its name, but never its nature. The monsters of the Middle Ages are gone. Yes, their castles have crumbled, their bones long turned to dust. But their echoes, they're still here, in every story of cruelty, in every act of betrayal, in every quiet moment where compassion gives way to control. Maybe that's why these tales draw us in. Not because we admire the darkness, but because, in some strange way, we're trying to understand it. We want to believe that evil can be seen, that it wears a face, that it lives in distant centuries or haunted ruins. Because if it does, then maybe it's something we can defeat. But the deeper truth, whispered softly by history itself, is that the real danger has always lived within us. The same fear, the same hunger, the same fragile line between order and chaos. All still here, just dressed in new clothes. So tonight, as the candlelight fades and your room grows quiet, think of those who once lived in that dim, flickering world of nights and superstition. They feared the dark for reasons we can still understand. They built walls and churches to keep the shadows out. But maybe, just maybe, they were never outside at all. Maybe they were always inside, waiting for the moment when no one was watching. And yet, for all its horror, the Middle Ages were also a mirror of survival, proof that humanity can live with its own darkness and still build, still love, still hope. That's the strange gift of history. It reminds us that we've been here before, that the line between good and evil has always been razor thin, and that understanding the past, even its ugliest corners, is what keeps us from walking blindly into it again. So, as you let these thoughts settle, take a deep breath, and if you found yourself lost in the quiet pull of tonight's story, I'd love for you to stay a while longer. Like the video if you enjoyed the journey, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Each night, we'll walk together through the forgotten corridors of history, calmly, gently, exploring the shadows, not to fear them, but to understand them. Now dim the lights just a little more, close your eyes if you wish, and let the echoes of the past fade softly into silence. Because though the stories end, the night is always listening.